of many lectures to welcome one of our own in for the evening to present and talk about the work that he's been doing that, like many of us, has been shaped very much indeed by being in this building, in this room. It's great to welcome George tonight. I think it's fair to say that one of the cliches, the near cliches of contemporary architecture of our time would be images of the deformed surface, whether it's wrinkled, bent, twisted, or contorted in various ways. And I think one of George's great accomplishments is to go beyond the imagery of that kind of cliche to really make it a sustained and very real indeed topic for his ongoing investigations and projects. As he's described it over the years, the work that he's been doing in the unit here and in his own projects in London and other cities now around the world is fundamentally centered around an investigation of the mathematics and really the numerical modeling and design of the surfaces that make up his projects very much as a kind of three-dimensional entity. For George, the surface in all of its concepts, terms, and images is a kind of built material that's describable by the underlying mathematics that can be seen to relate to it. Those descriptions and the models that are on display upstairs with his work and that are included in the book that we've just published that's out documenting the work of the unit, those images and those projects are very much relational in their description, and in that description emphasizing in a very literal way the relationship between elements, values, operations, and other features that combine together to create those surfaces. And that relational description is really what cuts to the core of it being an investigation into the parametrics of surfaces. And a parametric sensibility and interest is, of course, one of the really foundational features of George's work over the last several years. And in fact, it can be found in the title of the company that he's created as the basis for that work, the IJP Corporation. IJP is also the title of the first book that this school published on George's work a few years ago. And IJP, as I think many of you know, IJP stands for the values or the variables that are built into standard formulations of surfaces and parametric relationships. George very cleverly kind of twists those around to create an identity for an incredibly unique and sustained body of work that he's going to be showing us something of tonight. The talk tonight by George coincides with the exhibition, which of course you guys have all had the chance to see upstairs. Not the Last Word is the chosen title for it, and it's a title for a show that and I think in a really compelling way tries to connect the work within the unit that he's been leading over the last several years here, Diploma Unit 5 with Luis, to his own work, which is unfolding within the office. And I think the kind of meditation on the relationship and very real differences but connections between those two things is, of course, part of what makes it a really great show to look at, and is extended very much by the contents of Body Lines, which I think we'll have a copy we can show you later tonight, which documents the work of several of the student projects that have taken place over the last 3 or 4 years within the unit. Body Lines is a small document of about 8 or 9 projects or studies that are structured in quite a funny way along a spectrum between figuration and abstraction. And I think one of the compelling features of the unit's work is a kind of intellectual generosity to let projects span across that sometimes very contentious, contested terrain. I think rather than projects being a purely figural, resemblant kind of figure, or at the other extreme, highly abstract serial structures, one of the great things that it shows is the way in which the unit has tried to work across the entire spectrum of those sorts of topics. George and Luis have taken a year off from the unit this year after about 4 years here in the school, and not quite burned themselves out, but let's say reached a stage where they wanted to step back and critically assess where the work is, which I think is a great thing for all of us to be doing, not just in our teaching but our own work in a place like this. George has been doing that alongside the projects that he's been developing in the office, putting together the exhibition and the publication here. And we're very pleased, in fact, that as a part of that step away from the unit, he's also been able to go forward with some seminars in both the diploma school here, which he did last autumn, the seminar on formalism, which he took the students through, and then this term's seminar on the mathematics of the surface that he's been leading with the the DRL group in the Graduate Design School. George has, before teaching at the AA, taught at the GSD, and is currently a visiting professor at Princeton University, where he teaches seminars, and his work has been published and exhibited worldwide. Please join me in welcoming George.
Well, thank you very much for these kind words. I would like to basically offer some thanks first, obviously, to thank Brett for giving me the opportunity for the exhibition and the publication this year. I would also like to thank the students of Deep 5 who've made the really the year of their tutors, Luis, Urabes, and myself, for the last 3 years. I would also like to extend a personal thank to Hanif Kara and Paul Scott of Adams Kara Taylor for supporting my practice. Basically, IJP is a very, very small company, and it wouldn't be playing anywhere near where it's at now without the faith that AKT puts in this work. Finally, I'm also going to ask you to bear with me for a second. Prior to beginning the lecture proper, I would like to basically talk a little bit about the past. When I came to the AA, there's a part of me that I repressed because I really wanted to be someone else, and I used the kind of transatlantic move to achieve that. Now that I am, I think, someone else, I can sort of, in hindsight, just go back and actually show you something that happened in the mid-90s. It's not firing up. Just a second. Sorry about that. As a young assistant professor in America during the mid-90s, I wasted an unbelievable amount of time, basically make things like what you're seeing right now on the screen. This particular piece was called Salto Arte, which is Italian for tumbling art. And I'm sure that Shin Negashira will no doubt recognize Panamarenko's Ladybug, which the interactor here on the screen is trying to handle with the sole help of an infrared pointer. When I say that I wasted a lot of time, I mean it rhetorically, of course, because I would do it all over again. You see, when I left graduate school in 1994, I was still using an old email client called Pine, which ran on Unix workstations. By the time I returned to school a year later, Mosaic, the first graphical browser, was out. And so was the first release of Windows, Netscape, the first standard of HTML, and the first flavors of the Java API. The computer gurus like Tinsley Gallion and David Small had not even graduated from MIT yet, and John Maeda had just been appointed head of the Aesthetics and Computation group in the Media Lab, when one of his very, very first students, Reed Cram, today the software whiz behind a lot of AMO's Prada work, turned up on my doorstep wanting to know more about the mathematics of quadratic curves. In 1996, basically, Cambridge, Massachusetts stood at the heart of the technology party, and I would have been completely mad to miss out. So I basically just got seriously into it, dragging behind me basically at least 2 generations of Harvard design students who really should have known better, and ditched architecture to take up the dark arts of media and computation. The scenario basically was always the same. Like a talented European architecture student, say from France or Germany, who had interned, say the summer before, with Enrique Miralles, but failed to make the grade with Rem's project on the city thesis group, would join us instead, learn to program a computer before doing a couple of years' work in my research lab, and then moving on to a highly paid job with Razorfish, Sapient, Capgemini, you name it, whatever it's called nowadays, where 10 years on, he's still basically happily hacking away. You see, for that generation, which is my generation really, because back then there was really no age gap between me and the students, the decision to step aside architecture, even momentarily, was often a one-way ticket. From the American years, I have kept 3 things only. The first is a sort of belief in the machinic nature of the design process, meant quite literally, and with no fear of sounding reductive. Unlike, say, a building proposal, whose ultimate quality and programmatic performance are a matter of nuanced, subjective, and endlessly debated arguments, the electronic assembly of Salto Arte that you see on the screen is, for better or worse, a much simpler proposition. When you finally get to push the button, the several thousand lines of code behind it will either run or they won't. You see, that's the machinic moment of truth. And though I no longer care for this kind of work, I have made mine the ethic of the press the button moment, which the MIT Media Lab sums up in its founding motto and serves to students basically on the eve of every great presentation. And the motto is demo or die. I myself died at least once, and I can assure you that it's not funny at all. The second thing I got out of this was a sense of the relentless technicity of form. Like I said, the VRML Java source code behind this piece is about 64,000 lines long, a good quarter of which was basically written by hand, and the rest by cut and paste. In this form, and regardless of its content, the material is simply unprintable. Looking for the inevitable mistakes requires the use of a specialized text editor, and which has its own instrumental logic, and very quickly the entire thing becomes just a technical nightmare. Most importantly, the third and final finding, that I basically got and brought with me from the States, was a discovery that form could indeed be written. See, through my brief exposure to the fantastic formalized languages of computation, which French linguists call the langage formalisé, I realized that contrary to the notion of shape, with which it is often confused, you see, form is actually a syntactic, procedural, and increasingly technical sort of, if you like, problem whose disciplinary autonomy really parallels the study of language, say, in the era of structuralism, or in this case, the development of object-oriented programming in the contemporary software industry. Looking back, of course, to conclude this introduction, I find that a piece like Salto Arte was exceedingly hard work. During the frequent all-nighter coding sessions, I sometimes heard voices inside my head. Across the street from us stood Memorial Hall, a sort of collegiate Gothic theater dedicated to the victims of the American Civil War. It was decorated with statues of dead white men, among which I thought I recognized Jacques Bossuet, basically a French 17th century Catholic writer, known briefly for having been regent to Louis XV. Now, the reason I knew of him was that he also happened to be the patron and the namesake of the Catholic boys' school that I had attended back in the mid-70s. So very late at night, while gazing into the blue glare of my computer screen, the sight of Bossuet peering out of his medallion in my general direction and waving at me was in fact rather comforting. I mean, clearly the old dude was trying to figure out what I had been up to these days. Or maybe he was just trying to figure out whether I had been smoking in my office again. It was and still is illegal in Massachusetts. But in any case, 4 years of this was enough. I packed my things, destroyed my compilers, and never looked back. Sorry, this wasn't scripted, but the whole thing died on me. Fast forward to 2006, and the question at hand is basically that, as Brett basically explained, we've just published a modest collection of Deep 5 studies, which appear to have nothing to do with this lecture. Or do they? You see, imagining a building is really a prospective activity. In other words, as architects, we are obviously willing new things into being, and in this sense, we must come to terms with the most fundamental question, which is, the transition from nothing to something. The variable 3D surface, which I am using as subject matter and vehicle of exploration in my writing, my teaching and practice, is therefore just a pretext. And as I wrote in AA files, not just any pretext, but really the worst I could get hold of. You see, I've chosen this subject precisely because it is seemingly unsuitable for speculating on architecture. In other words, unless you consider it purely aesthetically, the variable 3D surface is basically an incredibly messy business. You know, it's very, very technical. It's resistant to ordinary means of representation and analysis. Its structure says nothing about potential physicality. Any move you do requires a lot of sort of material reinterpretation, and so forth and so forth. And yet, if the emergence of materiality is really what we have in mind, those fundamental constraints are not actually that bad. I don't think they are necessarily counterproductive. As I intend to show throughout this lecture, they could even be of great help. I actually like the surface. I like the surface because it offers us practical and theoretical challenges, analogous, if you like, to the challenges of, let's say, I wouldn't say traditional, but let's say standard architectural discourse, with the difference that the focus on materiality, iconicity, instrumentality, and performance is basically sensibly shifted. In other words, thinking about the surface is thinking about architecture, but by analogy. And the analogy is productive because, to some degree, it prevents us from making direct and automatic associations. We don't have to worry, for instance, about what things look like or what they're supposed to look like. Suffice, or it's enough, really, to focus on what they actually do. For the past 4 years, Diploma Unit 5, our research group here at the AA in the Diploma School, explored the twin paradigms of descriptive notation, which are basically the points and lines of projective geometry, which you see on the right of this slide, and analytic geometry, which is the surface of modern mathematics and computation, which appears right here on the left. Now, the distinction, of course, is purely historical, and it goes back to the 17th and 18th century when basically algebraic symbolism was struggling to break free from the figures and points of geometry, mostly through the work of Descartes, Pascal, and a few others. Personally, of course, I like to think of it, if you like, at a more fundamental level. In other words, between those two images, the essential distinction between symbols and figures, the distinction between the textual, if you like, and the iconic. The descriptive surface served Dip 5 really well, and I've been told that in British English, serves you well is actually negative. But in American English, it's actually positive, and that's how I mean it tonight. With it, we did a number of projects which took the body as a site, but never really took directly from it, looking instead, if you like, for surfaces modeled on the body's external data, its measurements and dimensions. And that is basically the material collected today in Bodyline. Art historically speaking, the development of this modest little project is quite straightforward. Beginning in 2002, we started with rather figurative meshes from the computer gaming industry, and then quickly moved on to sort of micro-narratives of pattern and garment, in which the body, as you can see on the screen, was already all but unrecognizable. This one here was about growth as a form of decay, a sort of metaphoric, if you like, take on basically the uncontrolled multiplication of cancer cells and the distortions it visits on the sick body. In the final year, which was 2 years ago, we made self-portraits using projective networks, of Mongian geometry, a notation invented now more than 200 years ago. Technically speaking, this final study took us back to the 18th century, where we started from. And yet, paradoxically, in its merciless abstraction, it produced the most contemporary vision of all. In other words, just as it is, for instance, in the work of Pollock or de Kooning, the human body disappeared, and the subject itself emerged only, if you like, through effectively registration and technique, against the background of an abstract theme, such as, in this case, for instance, inversion, reciprocity, or the act of collection. Having reached this final stage of abstraction, we ended the experiment and collected it, basically, in this little unit book. The largest share of this publication is about flat patterns. And you see, as always is the case with instruments, the theme weighed very heavily on the final form of the book. Faced with two good cover options, which you see right now on the screen, one textual, basically, and one figurative, designer Alon Kay and myself basically just couldn't make up our minds as to the most suitable design. So, unwilling to compromise, we ended up printing the two options on basically opposite sides of the same sheet, and then got the open-minded printing house to bind the book in both ways. Now, you see, rather than two different covers, like say, Bruce Mouse's Lifestyle Collection, Bodyline has basically one double-sided cover, which is simply turned inside out, halfway through the printing run, much like a sort of double garment may be flipped over to expose its lining. So what you saw before is, let's say, one copy, which has obviously the other cover in the inside there. The net effect of the move is that, a bit like a mating plug, Bodyline is what I would call a book with a gender. I'm not sure who is who just yet, but it's clear to me that in order to sort of reassemble, if you like, the totality of the cover, whether it's the full textual or iconic surface, you can go for what's on the screen, male to male, female to female, male to female, or in this case, female to male, knowing that in the last two options, you actually have to intertwine the books rather than just juxtaposing them side by side. I do hope that our publisher will actually see it that way and discount the pair. So I won't say more about this playful experiment, which cost us a few months of work. Instead, I will simply and shamelessly flog the book by reading out a few of its most outrageous bits, Sunday Telegraph style, in the sort of secret hope of luring you into buying a copy. The familiar gestures of dressing and undressing are still awaiting their historian. Now, the lack of critical interest in a routine that takes place at least once every day is somewhat puzzling, although, come to think of it, there may be a good reason for it. You see, for all the occasional titillation, there is not much to say about it in the first place. The act of undressing has a generally limited scope: to have sex, to get ready for bed. Alice's expansions, and that's Alice in Wonderland, which is one of the themes of the project, have been preoccupying scholars for some time. There is something weird about them. Sipping the contents of a bottle marked with the words, "Drink me," makes Alice shrink down to about 10 inches. Nibbling a cake with the words "Eat me" on them basically makes her stretch back to approximately 10 feet. Now, in between movements, the girl is holding her hand basically on the top of her head, trying to figure out which way she's going, if she's heading up or she's heading down. Oddly, there is in fact no noticeable effect. She's even surprised to find that her size has remained the same, which, to be sure, writes Lewis Carroll, is what generally happens when one eats cake. In the opening lines of Logic of Sense, Gilles Deleuze sensed rightly that Alice's bodily movements announce the advent of a new dimensional sensibility. Unfortunately, his explanation, which is, when I say Alice is growing, I mean that she is taller than before. By the same token, she's also gotten smaller than she's now. Not at the same time, of course, although it does happen concurrently. She is taller now, she was shorter then. All at once we will grow taller than before and make ourselves smaller than we've become, was famously incomprehensible. As a general rule, in the 3D character meshes found on the web, male and female anatomies are equally represented. The female bodies are usually anatomically correct. They have clear feminine features, except for the baldness, which afflicts them most of the time. And there is basically a very simple reason for that. Modeling a full shock of hair is computationally expensive, and then when it comes to signifying femininity, if you like, the efflorescences of being simply comes second to a prominent bust. In 1960, Juan Miró returned to the canvas self-portrait, 1937-38, and applied additional features to it. As you can see on this picture, in the curled stroke of his post-war manner, he painted a head, 3 hair, 2 eyes, 3 blots of colors, and a pair of testicles. The result is more significant than it is indicative. At first glance, the self-portrait seems to have been defaced. It then becomes evident that for all its crude application, over the underlay of the figurative drawing, the formless graffiti basically denotes, or rather connotes, the identity of the painter far more clearly than the figurative underlying ever did. The completed piece is unmistakably a self-portrait by Juan Miró. Exploring the surface is for me primarily a problem of notation, and for some time now I've chosen to explore it basically primarily in terms of writing. Now, by writing I do not mean musing in writing in conceptual terms, which is what I did in Bodyline, or what I also happen to be doing right now, but approaching it through symbols and marks rather than figures and images. I will do my best to explain this, touching along the way on basically two things, two projects, which sort of bring us a complementary understanding of the surface as notation. These projects sort of give us sort of different sense of, if you like, the reality of the surface or the reality itself, period. I have chosen, in the spirit of balance, basically a book, another book, the first one, and an actual infrastructure proposal, a recent £7 million competition prize winner, moving into construction now within a month. Both, in this case, are surfaces. Since writing is a performance that typically takes place on the expanse of the page, if you like, the action that I'm thinking of involves basically the material surface as both obviously subject matter and material support. We write about the surface on the surface, if you like, and if you like, that implication leads to all sorts of what you would call metonymic shifts, which have a very sort of productive effect on the concepts themselves. Now I know that this does not sound terribly clear, so let me give you an example taken from my work as a writer. Unlike Bodyline, though, I'm not going to discuss the contents of this book, because that would be really boring. I'm just going to focus on its form, on its structure, if you like. IJP, the Book of Surfaces, which came out in March 2003, taps the affinity between publishers' book spread and the mathematicians' developed surface, both of which draw on the same concept of basically matrix and field. So in some ways, the form of the book reflects the double affiliation, if you like, stated in the title and subtitle. In other words, the pages of the manuscript are laid out as a spread, they're composed and numbered as a developed surface, and they're bound in book form. The first two pages present the layout of the work as a matrix basically of 9 rows and 18 columns. Since matrices have rows and columns, obviously every page of the book is identified with 2 numbers rather than 1, which is sometimes a bit confusing in bibliographies and footnotes. The layout shown here is the book's table of contents, which is also a developed surface, and also the scaled surface, the scaled down surface of the book itself. The analogy, if you like, with the mathematical precedent is very, very direct. You see, just as a curved region of the surface will span several adjacent polygons, a surface diagram will straddle several pages of the spread. At first glance, the result is, I think, quite familiar. It might remind us of a sort of street guide, say our famous London A to Z, with the difference that, you see, where A to Z depicts the city at a fixed scale, IJP uses several. Some diagrams cover 4 sheets, others 16, and offer vastly different amounts of detail. For the record, the first 2 pages of the spread, which are up there in the top left corner, are part of the spread itself. In a rare moment of disagreement with my editor, I basically just asked him to, flag those 2 cells with a familiar "you are here," basically sign of guides to public spaces, because I saw a nice parallel with the map and the urban signpost, as well as a clear display of conceptual self-reference. A strange loop of sorts, if you like, a micro version of the spread inside the spread itself, and so on to infinity. He didn't really think it was a good idea, so basically he rubbished it. The title itself, which Brett referred to in his introduction, raises suggestive formal problems. IJP is not an acronym. It does not stand for anything at all. You see, the question, what does IJP mean, is the question that I get asked all the time. And basically my negative answer seems to usually surprise, the listeners. I'm not sure why. It may be that, if you like, the 3 letters basically form so many abbreviations out there that a meaningless IJP comes in as a bit of a surprise. Now, for the record, and some of you know that, if you Google IJP, you will retrieve around 78,000 hits, none of which is our company, but you will find basically Indian Journal of Pharmacology, International Journalist Programs, International Justice Progress, Intermodal Journey Planner, Interagence Jeune Presse, International Journal of Prosthodontics, and so on. In fact, there is even more. You see, in Poland and in the Czech Republic, 2 two institutes were named after men called, respectively, Jerzy Pilsudski and Jan Pernera. You see, as a matter of fact, in Poland alone, and I apologize really in advance for my diction to anyone that might be from there in the audience, maybe Bogdan, you find an Instytut Języka Polskiego and an Instytut Józefa Pilsudskiego, among which, I guess, the competition for IJP, the contraction, the acronym, the logo, the domain, the idea, must be particularly fierce. My own personal favorite is Infant Jesus of Prague, an international religious establishment, rather misleadingly based in Illinois. It would perhaps make a lot of sense to ask the question, what does IJP not stand for? Our title's take on the mysterious three obviously comes from mathematics. The explanation appears somewhat reflexively on page 1,4, where 1 is I and 4 is J. And as Peter Carl, who's here tonight with us, wrote in his review of the book, the index I basically is the index of a row, the J is the index of a column, and P is a particular symbol that I basically added, which refers to the kind of special form of, I quote, interrelatedness possessed by points on a surface determined by functions and parameters. But in any case, observing that even the distribution of typographic characters functions like this, right? In rows and columns, from top to bottom and left to right, we could say that IJP resorts to writing, layout, binding, typesetting to capture the surface as both subject and object of knowledge. I promised I would not talk about content, but I can't help it, very briefly at least. You see, the kind of surface discussed in the book is neither modeled nor drawn, but written. IJP is therefore not only about the tectonic surface as a visual construct, but as a product of two kinds of writing in which figure and symbol play equal parts. In this sense, the subject is a little bit understood like an ideogrammatic practice, if you like, part letter and part graphic at once, much like an Eastern alphabet and script. The influence of Japanese aesthetics on IJP is immense, not least through the work of computer scientist and artist John Maeda, whom at Brett's instigation have been trying to invite at the AA now for over a year. With the possible exception of Peter Eisenman, nobody influenced me more. On a similar aside, the key influence of Japanese aesthetics informed last year's agenda of Diploma Unit 5. In this case, though, the pedagogical project entitled Learning Japanese was primarily based on Roland Barthes' structuralist reading of A Science-Saturated Japan, which we use as a guideline and index. Barthes' texts support Deep 5's fondness for the elaboration of references over the sort of individuated expressions of meaning. In other words, what I mean is that, like Barthes, we casually chose form over content, or, in linguistic terms, the signifier over the signified. And in this, both Barthes and we were merely following the Buddhist aphorism that, I quote, the form is empty. The form of IJP has invited two exquisitely pointed criticisms. The first, by Cambridge University reviewer and Princeton alum Peter Carl, states that there is some question as to whether this should have been a book or a wall, and is absolutely spot on. As you can see on the screen, in a move that had us destroy some 5 copies before achieving the desired effect, the wall was the form we originally went for at the book launch held here in the front members' room, while urging visitors and well-wishers to purchase a second copy in order to try the wall effect basically on their own. What you see here is basically the table of contents at full scale, which is the book itself, posted in the front members' room after the party. The second criticism leveled at the book, also by Peter, is that, I quote, its achievement lies in the poetic domain. And that too is right, provided, of course, that we do not take poetic as in poetry, but as in language and the making of meaning. For the record, as you can see on the screen up there, IJP does include 6 lines of indexical verse, which technically at least is enough to make me a published poet. But that observation misses the point altogether. Every word, every sentence, every paragraph that emphasizes the form of the message is automatically poetic. And that simple fact sums up quite nicely my instrumental understanding of the surface. Let me now say a few words about the kind of surfaces I'm interested in. Parametric surfaces are about the relational interplay of three things, basically three mutable terms. Each term is sort of set to freely modulate the surface form in one dimension, which results in a form that varies without distinction in, say, breadth, width, and length. This form will reflect, if you like, the active instrumental roles of these three relations, which serve as its genetic material and program. The three relations are known as parametric equations, and with one basically per spatial coordinate, writing, if you like, or modeling a surface in space becomes a matter of writing a transformation and then assigning it to the correct dimension. As you can see on this slide over here, one does not need a seminal kind of formal idea to get started with, only intuitions and a working knowledge of spatial transformations. These are more like abstract relations, if you like, between given forms, and they're often expressed exclusively with mathematics, at least, you know, in my take and deep fives. They're likely to produce effects of uniformity, non-uniformity, repetitiveness, you name it, knowing that basically each transformation and the dimension really to which it is applied will jointly determine a final result. Designing something like that is, of course, very abstract because it amounts to putting something together not piece by piece, but relation by relation. Let me basically give you an applied example. Caroline here chooses a transformation, say linearity, pores over the mathematical worksheets, and cobbles together some equations to write basically a three-dimensional surface plot. Once the equations are written, she can basically modulate the surface in any dimension and adjust the ranges to thicken its texture. Later, she can basically just grind that surface into point coordinates and export them into graphical software that turns the numbers into lines, like basically beads on a string. The lines are then turned into solid geometry, and if a high-end system, a printing system, is available, they're sent to this machine, the numerically controlled sort of station, which checks them for validity. The process is repeated several times and may last well into the night. At some point, though, the station will take the virtual surface and feed it to this thing here, a 3D printing device. This machine rolls out coats of plaster from tank to tank and gradually laminates the form by simply dispensing, if you like, binder over basically the coat of plaster. And I think you can see the ghost of the surface to be right there in the middle of the screen. On more expensive systems, binding can also take place through laser sintering, as probably, you know, Achim Menges, for instance, would explain much better than I can do. But in any case, with every new generation, a fresh coat is applied, the layer is bound, and the emergent form is basically sinking a bit deeper into the tank to receive the next coat. When the process is complete, the powder is collected, hopefully recycled, and the surface form will finally appear. First, it has to be carefully exhumed out of the tank, usually by the specialized technician who comes chained to the machine. When we used to do that in Norway, there was always a Viking sort of attending to the whole procedures. When it's finally unearthed, the surface is brushed and cleaned, sometimes mechanically, before being strengthened with super glue. The tolerance of this machinery is absolutely astonishing. As the example clearly shows, the process of parametric generation produces a continuous surface made of lines, basically, or threads. There are two sets of them, one for I and one for J. And yes, these are the same indices that I mentioned in connection with the book. Speaking of which, in this image here, only one of the threads is visible, right there on the right. I turned the other one off because it really wasn't doing much for the form. This, by the way, is topology's famed Klein bottle, to which so many recent projects refer. Like a sort of fibrous material texture, the continuous surface of mathematics is nothing but a three-dimensional, intricate weave. The transition to matter, obviously then, is very straightforward. If the lines are two-dimensional, you can use them to define center lines for laser-cut profiles, as shown on this beautiful example by Åsa Nielsen. The tectonic expression of this model emphasizes the reading of the longitudinal threads, which form the full body of the surface itself. You see the presence of the other range, which you see here on the left, is somewhat obliterated, reduced to a sort of an elementary structural role that you can see in the foreground. Using these indexical threads to somehow dissociate structure and skin-related functions makes a lot of sense on the surface, but it also comes from and ultimately leads back to the kind of routine segregation of form and structure. What I'm saying is that looking at this slide, it is difficult to resist the iconicity of the load-bearing spine, and Kunmin Kim, who made this beautiful sample, must have had lots of ready-made references in mind. And yet, as this next example shows by Princeton graduate Yusuke Okabayashi, such decisions are in the end just pure problems of interpretation. In other words, as shown on this slide, if both indicial threads are given equal prominence, the resulting arrangement can function as a continuous, distributed, sort of centrally polycentric whole that blurs, if you like, the boundaries between function without really compromising the integrity of the form. What I like about this is that in this extraordinary example, there's really no blueprint, no pre-made reference, and obviously, I think, as you can tell, really none of the staidness that we casually and automatically associate with flatness and parallelism. If the threads are not two-dimensional, as shown on this other Deep 5 worksheet, we can use them to sort of doubly print the members in depth, just as I explained earlier. The structural and morphological questions raised by Q's, Emma's, and Zhang's model are, of course, very different. You see, this here is a peculiar example of a degenerate weave, a woven arrangement of indicial threads, which you can see on the lower left corner, is sort of veering into a disorderly sort of arrangement, as in a kind of seemingly uncontrollable cancerous mode, if you allow me once again that uncomfortable metaphor. Threads that used to be parallel intersect, as you can see on the slide, again, and the intersections are flagged in red. And half of the form is becoming then potentially self-structural. All you have to do is remove the other half, and the remainder then is laminated into this self-supporting structure that shares the peculiar kind of, if you like, characteristics of the morphology of an object that is both half and whole. I would say that this kind of game, the distributed self-supporting structural organization, is what really three-dimensional indicial threads are all about. This, by the way, is not a technical problem. It's really a conceptual one, and I think, as was quite clear, Yusuke and Princeton just pulled it off with a laser cutter, a technically inferior machine. In this last example, actually this is the previous one still, by Adiam Serzu, you see that the threads intersect basically 2 by 2 so as to provide a kind of local punctual adherence. They also move in space to form a closed loop whose overall sort of outline is somehow uncannily reminiscent of the outline of the figure itself. It's a perfect example of, I would say, Albertian concinitas, framed basically in instrumental terms rather than iconic ones. In other words, it doesn't look the part, but it really does it. In the end, all the choices that I've just been discussing can be traced back to basic questions of parametric modulation. In other words, how many indices do you have in your equation? Okay? Are the equations periodic? You know, which type of transformations are you looking at? There are various machinery-friendly equations, if you like, some of them completely suited to flat sheet cutting, others to lamination. The point that I'm trying to make, if you like, is that materiality does not always begin with matter. The possibility of producing material undercuts, recesses, self-intersections, holes, and other basically telltale signs of actual formal complexity is linked to the mathematical model's ability to describe variation, and it's also linked to our own ability and willingness, if you like, to qualify that variation conceptually. Consider really the case of the rather impressive medium of rapid prototyping that I just showed. Unlike the laser cutter, its technically inferior counterpart, the kind of one-to-one correspondence that it draws between data and artifact eliminates completely the need for tectonic interpretations. Is building without tectonics good or bad? The question is open. Is rapid prototyping primitive? Is the laser cutting advanced? Both systems do one thing very well. Personally, I love splitting hair about instruments because deep down, and I would say even on the surface, their limitations reflect our own. In late 2003, after nearly 8 years of basically daydreaming on a strictly theoretical plane, I co-founded a London-based company to explore a bit more systematically the natural intersections of geometry, space, and computation. Our first two commissions are large infrastructural interventions with obviously very complex structures and very simple briefs. Building, by the way, works exactly the other way around, or so I'm told in the opening pages of Complexity and Contradiction. At the moment, anyway, we're giving ourselves 1 more week to understand our instruments before reversing our priorities. The brief of our first build project is very simple indeed. As you can see on this slide, we were asked to link 2 ridge summits with a plane. The site is part of a 9-kilometer chain of hills stretching from Mount Faber to Telok Blangah Hill in Kent Ridge Park on the southern coast of the island of Singapore. The master scheme of the region called for plans, basically to link the southern ridges for people, basically to cycle through the chains and hills and explore the parks, as well as enjoy, panoramic views. The corresponding international bridge design competition proposed 2 alternative sites of intervention and called for proposals of really drastically different sizes, and you can see them both. I don't have a pointer, but on the right, you see right there Mount Faber is the first, and on the left, up there, Alexandra Link is the second. Picking a site was for us easy enough. Given the extreme relief and dramatic qualities of the setting, we opted for the big leap forward of Henderson Crossing, seen here on the right, versus the long crawl slowly towards Alexandra Link, which is there on the left. Our partie is also very simple. You see the bridge springs roughly from there, from a scenic point, right off Mount Faber, shown in the foreground, and lands on the southwest of the Telok Blangah Hill, spanning around 300 meters across a 6-lane freeway. This picture here is taken from the ring road, close to the actual springing point, looking forward basically towards the landing. And once you're on site, you actually find that you're buried in kind of secondary rainforest, and that it's really quite beautiful. On this very crude sort of a diagram, you can see that basically that's the partie. If you like, you leave from the loop at the bottom, then you walk on that sort of first platform to the springing point, which is right there on the left. Then you see that the structure is bending slowly towards the southwest point of the hill, at which point it reconnects with an existing, basically little ring, follows that to create a complete loop, at which point around there it does basically go under the substructure, where you can catch a glimpse of the sort of underside of the structure, and then you continue on westward towards Alexandra Link. Bridges usually have very, very simple briefs, which is to go from A to B. In our case, though, I would say that the brief was even simpler than that. To leap over the gap, and generally speaking, to do everything with 1 equation only. This is actually possible, provided that you cave in a bit and subdivide the domain of application into basically discrete portions in order to address problems on an ad hoc basis as they come. The equation seed we ultimately went for is basically a direct application of my research in periodic transformations, as described on page 2,8 of IJP, where true to form, and as I was discussing with Francesca a few days ago, not unlike some early mathematical propositions written in medieval Arabic, the equation of the surface is only described verbally. I chose to work with a parametric pillow, a 3D surface obtained by composing 1 linear transformation with 2 periodic ones, which was the ones you see on the screen there. The pillow is really a classic. You see, it's a product of 3 forces. The first is basically diagrammed as an oblique plane, and you see it over there in the square in the middle. The second one is a sort of, if you like, let's say slightly involuted periodic transformation that you see over there, which simply produces a sort of wave-like diagram of sorts. And the third one, which is the hairiest, produces sort of a, if you like, combination, a sort of a checkerboard of peaks and troughs, which is over there. As the ranges vary, the pillow split basically into 2 cells, or 3, or as many as you like, as if tightly held in place by several knots. And then, of course, you can rip it open. Using equations, you can write anything you want. As you can see on this slide, some of the results not only look groovy, but they're also likely to remind us, rather uncannily in fact, of forms one could arrive at by more traditional means, say by using Rhino or Maya. Where there is nothing, basically, where there is nothing, everything is possible. But in this case, specific structural considerations drove the process. With Adams Cara-Taylor, we decided to stay away from fancy expressions. We basically went for a comparatively boring scheme, which maintains, if you like, the structural integrity of the surface's long lines, which you see here in an early sort of material trial. Basically, again, we went for a form that you could diagram as a series, if you like, of arches and catenaries. In hindsight, this was not a bad move, since having won the competition, we are also required to build it. Here it is. Basically, the surface form is inflected in all three dimensions. It bends, undulates, and climbs by 20 meters, all in one go. In the process, it also deforms and self-intersects to provide basically access, shelter, scenic viewing for marathon runners, cyclists, and pedestrians. You see the final scheme has 9 waves. The tallest one in the middle is about 6 meters high by 57 meters span. The other spans are around basically 24. The developed length of the deck, if you like, from beginning to end is around 300 meters. And the difference between the low and the high points, between springing and landing, is roughly equivalent to a 7-story housing block. It is by any means a very large structure. To bridge the gap between springboard and landing without going over the prescribed slope, which is that you have to basically drive someone with, on a wheelchair, really is what it is, the surface has to bend in plan, as you can see on this slide. But it also has to rise steadily, while undulating periodically. Somewhere in the center of the form, the periodic motions sort of induced by the equations make it glide basically out of alignment in all 3 dimensions until, as you can probably see on this slide, something quite strange happens. You see, the motions make us misread often the view shown here for some kind of bird's eye view, when in truth it's basically just an elevation, a good old facade, if you like. In other words, every profile that you see on this particular surface form is parallel to the next, and they're all parallel to the plane of the paper. The nearest equivalent to this kind of effect would be, say, the Cavalier cabinet projections found among other places in the early drawings of Stephen Holl, except that here the effect isn't graphical, but actually spatial. For those familiar with parametric equations, the problem of misreading views is really all too common, and there was some of that discussion, I think, going on 3 days ago with Christus and Hanif regarding the sort of inapplicability of drawing to the structure. But as far as I'm concerned, I think that since parametric surfaces have no primary data of reference, most views indeed are easily trumped. Making ordinary projections completely useless, I would say, is even one of the hilarious side effects of parametric modulation. And just to make this really clear, on a typical sheet like this, which our prospective contractors are using to price the job right now as we speak, up to maybe 95% of the distances shown cannot and should not be measured directly off the drawing, which prompted me to add a much needed disclaimer, which I'm hoping will save me when the lawsuit strikes. This is the form seen from below, and this is how motorists will see it. And this is it from above. If you look at the surface form closely, you will see that the left portion is actually slightly infected. I will spare you basically the details, but the inflection is very subtle, because not only is the form basically bending and ascending, but at the same time it's broken by horizontal landings that break its continuity. Every flight and threshold of this discontinuous surface is computed by a specific variant of the equation. This here, for instance, is the equation of one of the first landings. It's a lot of math for a landing. The numbers are collected up to the 4th decimal from 160 different math tables, all held together in one basically master spreadsheet. When I did this a year ago, I was not yet a practicing architect. In fact, I felt more like an air traffic controller, not to mention that I began hearing the voices again. I am slightly new to this game. I do not know what the tolerances of the building industry are, but I suspect that this is the first and last quarter-mile long handicap access ramp ever designed with periodic equations. The entire set of calculus now is decorating, the back wall upstairs, where it provides a sobering counterpoint to Omar al-Omari's exuberant formal exercises. This is an early diagram of the bridging context, the model of the competition submission. In the foreground is a springing point on Mount Faber. And in drawing, really, the starting point looks a little more like this. And this is the arrival area at the other end. And you can see that true to form, absolutely everything is threaded, including the site. I mean, in truth, the landing is a bit more detailed and looks like this. Just for the anecdote, while visiting the exhibition, with the results of the competition in Singapore, I noticed like an incredible amount of straight lines among the submissions of our competitors. And I found that actually quite surprising. Given the accessibility and topographic requirements handed out to us, double curvature is not a matter of fancy. It's actually really a matter of necessity. It's the only way you can actually do it. Perhaps there's been some kind of misunderstanding or even disregard for the very simplicity of the brief. Former Deep 5 student and IJP member Lawrence Lur is explaining to a slightly incredulous development minister, Ma Baotan, the Stephen Holl elevation effect. In terms of structural expression, as I'm sort of driving slowly towards the conclusion, the bridge demonstrates the principle of the abstract models that I showed earlier. It systematizes and amplifies the structural problem of converting selected indexical threads into material members with specific structural roles. In other words, morphology and structure are closely linked. This here is a transversal thread, or I thread, after the ubiquitous index I, which makes another appearance here, this time in the guise of a steel beam. This thread serves basically for the physical construction of the surface form and the lateral stability of the bridge. The so-called Stephen Holl effect has actually one really nice key benefit, which is that all these guys are flat and parallel to one another. So the real thing will be actually manufactured just as this laser cut trial that I made here early on. And that's it in drawing. I threads 73 and 81 will become structural. There's 83 in total. And all the others, in theory, should be in timber. The kind of mirror symmetries that I was describing earlier in relation to the mathematics have actually a very, very nice effect. You see, the surface form is unbelievably redundant. In other words, of the 500 curved profiles that you have, only 80, in fact, are unique, and all the others are copies, which obviously makes it a lot cheaper. Along the other range, the longitudinal threads J fulfill the essential demands, basically, of the structural primary structure. J threads I 1 and 20, and of course that's J as in IJP, provide a central spine, which is the sort of straight-looking piece that you see on the slide, whereas the other one provides basically the arch, which is a sort of alternatingly arch and catenary sort of element that you see over there. That's what it might look like in reality or in drawing anyway. J thread 26 becomes the mid-height member. You see this thing in the sort of foreground. This was added basically by AKT. It's actually a very beautiful member that sort of reinforces the stability and allows really for the almost unbelievable slenderness of the overall structure, even in Singapore, where engineers are very cautious and are known for basically overdimensioning structures. Everything obviously needs to be flattened out, and therefore at some point I built a primitive development machine. I hope this would help me basically achieve the real thing, which so far only the little competition model has achieved, which is double curvature in basically all members. And of course, it didn't work. This here is the first sort of, if you like, incarnation of the complete structure. It's one of the small waves. It's about 1/10 of the bridge. Even at this scale, the full model would be around 3 meters long. And the pylons basically will be resting right there. You can see where there is a sort of bow tie, which is where the surface is self-intersecting, and the bridge becomes as thin as one beam. The relationship of the structure to the landscape is incredibly blunt, and that puts a lot of formal pressure on the piles. You see the tallest one rises to around 40 meters. And clearly, these are, the most salient features of the entire design, very complicated technically, and nobody likes them. But the key challenge, design-wise, is the superstructure, where we walk and sit and lounge and have a sandwich or something. Diagrammatically speaking, it's nothing but a very thin veneer given to us by a series of variations on the primary equation. It's fully pliant, and everything, absolutely everything, takes place on top of it. Along the line of self-intersection, which I just mentioned, the supersurface creeps out of the pocket and bends into a banister. And this here would be a sort of typical early section between waves. Inside the cavities, seating takes place in the folds of the supersurface itself. And in the tallest wave shown here, you see the supersurface rises to nearly 6 meters to provide protection from the rain. This is a typical plan. I mean, you can see that the slightly darker area will be for handicap, basically, or motor challenged individuals. The center is for pedestrians and cyclists, and then the seating areas inside the pocket where people can lounge and actually even sit and watch a marathon, which puts an unbelievable amount of strain on the structure. This is a long view of the timber deck. From the competition stage, I envisioned it as a sort of thin timber veneer stretched over the ribs. Timber, though, weathers incredibly fast in Singapore, and we had to basically do and try quite a few shades and essences before committing to a choice. In its final incarnation, the great supersurface will be made of yellow balau, a sustainable tropical hardwood sourced in the forests of Malaysia. The mock-up, kindly sent to us by the timber contractor Venture, which is on show upstairs, weighs around 260 kilos, despite being over 300 times shorter than the full thing. Ironically, and very much actually like my own little, if you like, laser cut trials, it got the geometry wrong. But that's what mock-ups are for. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that there are in fact very, very few square meters of horizontal area in this entire project altogether, which this mock-up is in fact showcasing. Most of it really is a lot more like this. Everything is basically oblique, sheared, trapezoidal, or worse, in fact, doubly curved, as you see, for instance, on this template, and it's all to be built in the same manner, with the exquisite craft demonstrated by the model upstairs. So please don't get me wrong. Despite its shortcomings, I really love this mock-up, and I would even say that it's really tailor-made for IJP, in the sense that in this office we spend, the sort of largest portion of our professional life and waking life, in fact, fighting first impressions. True to form, my office never does renderings. It should be clear by now that in the great divide between the textual and the iconic, I choose to be an iconoclast in a fully literal sense. I'm suspicious of images, especially of the synthetic kind, and even more so when those images are meant to depict the non-existent surface. Yet, what serves as well in school, here, in Deep 5 and in my seminars, which are always rendering-free zones, is really problematic on the other side. This project is receiving very little visual coverage in Asia, or anywhere for that matter, even though the images I routinely send or give my fellow journalists reproduce all the tropes of computer imagery. The reflection, the dynamic camera angles, the dramatic lighting. My correspondents just can't relate to the conventional nature of these particular images any more than they wish to accept the drawn views that accompanied the competition panel. I suspect that they find us a bit unprofessional, perhaps even a bit incompetent. There is some kind of misunderstanding going on, but it doesn't matter. I have waited long enough to get to this point, and I can wait some more. The project is going through tender now, and is over budget again, so things are a bit tangled up at the moment. Barring any delays or further, basically, periods of consultation, construction should begin within a month and a half. Thus, basically, the surface bridge synthesizes my theoretical concerns about the emergence of materiality, and the key role played by the variable 3D surface in the scheme of things. At this stage, I'm basically just grateful to be given free rein to take this research to its logical conclusion, the act of construction, building, in a seemingly simple, direct, and uncompromising manner. I am also grateful for your attention. I do not know what else to say. Thank you very much.
Give us some questions.
The deadline for submitting questions in writing was yesterday at midnight.
Can we open it up to questions? Would anybody have any to start? Shall I give them a minute or two? I'll start with one just to give them space. I think I think you demonstrate over and over again form is, let's say, form is what underlies the studies, the techniques, the mathematics, the projects themselves. I suppose a first question would be, what about form? I mean, is there, for example, a theory of form that this work is working in relation to? Is there work that you want form to do, which, say, one of your teachers like Eisenman might argue for, that in the end the form will be a record of machinic processes driven through the material of a project over and over again in either analog or digital ways in order to express nothing more than those processes? Are we looking at here a kind of form that's trying to register above all the relations at play, the superimposition of different operations, or is there something else behind it?
I don't think there's anything behind form, I mean, any more than there is anything behind the surface. If you like, I think you framed it quite nicely. If you like, the interest in the sort of early Eisenman work is an interest primarily about syntax. I mean, that syntax obviously can be, if you like, mute or not particularly talking or perhaps even sterile, but primarily the idea is that, for me anyway, the form work is, if you like, an intricate procedural, systemic approach to something that I think deserves an unbelievable amount of attention and effort. If I was to generalize the idea of form, I would say that it's like art, in the sense that art is difficult. In other words, you can't just sit down and produce something. There is a, how would say, a certain resistance of the material, the tradition, the syntax, the availabilities that you have, which deserve to become a kind of an autonomous concern in its own right. And that's why I think that form is, what we do, having in fact been exposed to both form and program. I mean, I studied with both Rem and Peter at Harvard. I learned nothing from Rem. And it's nothing because he didn't teach us anything. It was fantastic, but I was not in any way receptive to, let's say, the programmatic aspect, the way Peter framed, if you like, the syntactic problems, and which for me have been, immensely influential, even though, we're not, I'm not remotely doing, what he's doing today.
I mean, one of the things that stands out looking at the results over several years is, let's say, a move from the surface as a folded, manipulated entity to structures like this, which are increasingly, let's say, wave-like in their descriptions, which isn't, say, a shift from a bunch of straight edges to a kind of curvy operation. In that topologically they're the same thing, but clearly there's something going on there where the form is more and more in your use of periodic structures, for example, wave-like in its formation. I'm wondering if that's becoming a kind of, if you're articulating it more as a kind of topic, or it just happens to be an outcome of these particular projects?
It's a really, I think, great question, because as I said in the beginning, we framed the pedagogical experiment rather conveniently between, say, the two surfaces, which is one of the subtitles of the exhibition. The first surface, the descriptive one, to some degree, which, if you like, the fact that it's come out effectively as an art book showing abstract work rather than a project, for me is actually quite meaningful. Adi Amserdzo, actually, who's I think in the audience, did a thesis with, if you like, the first type of surface, which I think was as far as you can go. And that model, to some degree, even 2 years ago, we found to be a bit tired. The predominance of the analytic model, which is also the Bridge project, to some degree reflects, I think, a greater potential. But in Deep 5, we only did it for 1 year, and The first and best thing, which I haven't actually shown any of it this year, except obviously for Omar's work upstairs, is that we could start producing rudiments of space. So surface somehow developed into a core or a space.
Questions?
François?
Hi. Here, François.
How, I mean, you've well handled your presentation, and the work is really highly critical and things. And what I'm interested is, how are you critical about your work, and how do you actually frame, and when do you stop your form and start and say that's the one you want?
I think the answer lies somewhere upstairs in the exhibition. If you really try to figure out the difference between teacher-student, I'd say this is where actually if you like, the cutting point intervenes. In other words, comparing the unbelievable, basically sophistication and output of the theoretical trials of quote-unquote the student to the drabness and simplicity of what I am proposing, you realize that the critical effort in the case of a real project goes into a completely different kind of agenda. You see, for me, for instance, I had incredibly tight constraints, and I spent most, say, of my effort simply trying to build this metrical machine that allows to bring a handicapped person, up there. It sounds very trivial and very reductive, but to some degree, that's the other machinic moment of truth. Whereas if you look at, say, Omar's worksheets, they're absolutely fantastic because every single one is just testing one effect. And to that degree, it's open, it's incredibly rewarding, and it's also effectively open-ended. So the constraints that allow you to be critical are actually really programmatic, structural, and to some degree, yeah, the real thing. I don't know if I answered your question.
George, thanks very much. Thanks for
Thank you.